Welcome, dear listeners, to a story that could be happening right in your town, on a street you pass every day, or in a quiet church you've never paid much attention to. Tonight, something unimaginable happened in a quiet parish, where a coffin was lifted, and instead of silence, a laugh echoed through the chapel. Everyone froze, stunned, as the man they thought was dead returned. And now I ask you, where are you listening from tonight? In your own living room, on a late-night walk, or tucked away in a corner of the world you thought safe? Perhaps your town, too, could hold a secret that refuses to stay buried. Let's begin. It was generally agreed later that the chrysanthemum classes were too near the door. For the first half hour of the Flaxborough Autumn Produce and Poultry Show, a slow current of townsfolk drifted in, gasped fondly at the football-sized blooms, and then drifted out again before the Merrow mariners and bantam fanciers had a chance to register their contributions to civilization. Mrs. Glossop, who chaired the Ladies' Amenities Committee with the unblinking calm of a lighthouse, stood at the hinge of the double doors and redirected people with the same smile she used for bake-sale misers. Inspector Purbright, present in a capacity that could be described as civic ballast, had been given a seat beside the mayor and a plate upon which rested two triangular sandwiches of a suspiciously uniform pink. He regarded them with the courtesy due to unknown species, then set them behind the program so that they could not startle passers-by. Sergeant Love, who had never met a sandwich whose intentions he distrusted, hovered nearby. "I expect," said the mayor, a man whose waistcoat proclaimed an honest belief in municipal nutrients, "you will present the cup for utility poultry, Inspector. It is only right the police align themselves with utility." Purbright's eyes, mild as weather, travelled to the poultry pens. A rather superior barred rock was making contemptuous observations about the public. "With pleasure," he said. "We're always happy to be of service to production." It was at that moment that Mrs. Glossop's smile faltered for the first and only time that afternoon. The man who had just stepped neatly past her, apologizing, hats off, elbows considerate, would have been unremarkable if unremarkableness had not been, at that particular moment, his most remarkable feature. He was of middling height, slim but careful of his coat, with a cap whose brim had not been recently acquainted with fashion. His face had the tidy pallor of someone who had not bothered the sun for some weeks, and he walked with a slight reserve, as if some parts of his person had been wired for silence. No one would have noticed him had he not stopped at the bric-a-brac table. The bric-a-brac table was a junkyard's confession. There were horn-rimmed spectacles with only imaginary lenses, a small china dog whose tail had been repaired affectionately and inaccurately, a tarnished silver napkin ring, a curling iron that looked as if it had survived 2 marriages and a war, and, leaning against a stack of music books, a gentleman's walking stick with a silver band round the top. The man picked up the walking stick. He held it briefly, as a violinist might confirm the weight of a bow, and let his thumb rest upon the silver band. Then, as one testing a memory against a measurement, he turned the stick until the light from the high windows slid along the engraving. P.M. It might have stood for anything. The town contained, after all, a sufficiency of Peters and Phillips, and not a few Mortons. But the walking stick had a small nick just beneath the ferrule, the sort of injury that is both accidental and immediately recognizable to its accidentalist. And the man, seeing it, allowed a slow breath to leave him, as if some strictly kept internal valve had decided, in the circumstances, to be generous. Mrs. Glossop found her smile. 2 shillings, she said, for the amenities. The man fished in his pocket, laid a florin on the cloth, and after a fractional pause, selected a penny from his change and set it beside the florin, as if scrupulosity required its tribute. He signed the purchase book with a fountain pen that left a brownish line, wrote an address that was all corners, and moved away with the stick in his hand, not swinging it, which would have been jaunty, but carrying it upright, like a refrain. Miss Olive Teesdale, of the Public Library and of Views on Everything, had been examining the second prize jam. The first prize jam having gone to a person Miss Teesdale would have described as a hobby criminal. She turned, saw the man, and felt the sort of light pinch that memory gives to the self-respecting when it wishes to be taken seriously. "Good heavens," she said to nobody in particular. "How very like." "Like what?" asked Mrs. Hatch, whose curiosity had never been ill. "Like whom?" corrected Miss Teesdale. "Don't hover, Hilda. It encourages suspicion." "Who is he, then?" Miss Teesdale didn't answer. The man had paused by the chrysanthemums, as if polite men do this before attempting anything. He examined a label. "Bronze reflex, Mr. A. Crabbe," and made a small movement of the mouth, not smile and certainly not frown, more the private adjustment of a face unused to being public. Mr. Pomfret, the undertaker, had materialized like punctuation. Undertakers in Flaxborough did not haunt. They appeared, tidied a situation's grammar, and went away leaving things more syntactically inevitable. Mr. Pomfret's narrow head inclined slightly in the man's direction. His eyes, patient and uninterested, reflected lilies that were not present. He said, companionably, "Morning, Miss Teesdale." Miss Teesdale's mouth produced its primmest semicircle. "Surely," she murmured, "not morning any longer, Mr. Pomfret. We are well into the day's decline." "Always someone's morning," Mr. Pomfret said with professional breadth. The man, after the due homage to bronze reflex, approached the Poultry. Purbright watched him indirectly, the way a window watches clouds. The stranger stood with his walking stick balanced lightly between both hands, looked at a partridge Wyandotte that looked back with modern indifference, and then, catching sight of the utility poultry cup on the table, hesitated as though remarking upon a piece of furniture from a house he did not expect to revisit. "Love," Purbright said softly. "Sir." Love had the amiable readiness of a retriever presented with a biscuit that might conceal a pill. "Notice anything, sir?" "Only that he noticed," Purbright said. "It's catching." The raffle was announced, and the crowd concentrated in that serious way English crowds apply to minor arithmetic. The man with the walking stick drifted to the edge of the hall, near the door to the small anteroom where the tea-urn lived its stainless life. He seemed to be neither leaving nor staying. He had that scrupulous absence people achieve when they have not decided what they are. Miss Teesdale's pinch became a grip. "Mr. Pomfret," she said abruptly. "You had Mr. Mallow." "Had him," Mr. Pomfret repeated, not clinically but as if speaking of furniture. "Percival Mallow," Miss Teesdale said. "Drowned at Skegness, summer before last. Brought home later. The widow chose the hyacinths that stained one's gloves. You will recall." "Mrs. Mallow will recall," Mr. Pomfret said. "Widows generally do." Miss Teesdale's gaze, academic in its fairness, went back to the man. "Do you see," she said, "a resemblance?" Mr. Pomfret studied as one would study weather. "A general one," he said. "Enough for gossip, not enough for paperwork." On the platform, the mayor, who had not noticed the subtle alteration in atmospheric pressure, cleared his throat and thanked the Ladies' Amenities Committee collectively, individually, and statistically. Purbright clapped in the socially acceptable units. When his turn came to present the utility poultry cup, he did so with a small, agreeable speech that made observations about eggs which were as safe as eggs. As the photographer arranged the winner, the cup, and a Wyandotte that refused to occupy its designated moral position, Purbright's attention drifted again to the anteroom door. The man with the stick had gone. Purbright did not hurry. There is a speed in small towns that is the exact opposite of haste. It gets everywhere first because it is not seen. He walked to the anteroom, nodded to the urn, and stepped out into the short passage that led to the side exit. The air smelled of damp coats and furniture polish. There was no one there. Only a thin line of light at the bottom of the exit door suggested decisions. He pushed the door. Outside, the yard held its February sun like a cold saucer. A cat considered ethics beneath a trestle table. In the corner, on a stack of folded show posters, lay the walking stick. Purbright stood over it for a moment. The silver band, when it caught the thin sun, gave up its modest engraving. PM, the nick near the ferrule, was there, as honest as old damage. He went down, picked the stick up, balanced it across his palms as if weighing the town. Then he looked at the small, efficient purchase label tied by thread just below the handle. "And did you want me to fetch you a fresh plate, sir?" Sergeant Love's voice arrived, having taken the long way round to avoid offending anyone's sense of occasion. "Thank you, Love, but I'm still full of gratitude," Purbright said. He turned the label with a forefinger. The committee's purchase book number, a modest sum in ink, and beneath it the name of the buyer, written in tidy, firm strokes. Edward Lane. Love peered at the engraving. "PM, sir, that'd be Mr. Mallow, wouldn't it? Leastways, it was on his gravestone, them initials. I mean, with the rest of the wordage, naturally. Gravestones do tend to supply context," Purbright agreed. His tone did not move. Only his gaze did once toward the back gate opening onto Back Church Lane. "Edward Lane," Love read again, with the interest of someone noticing a stranger's socks. "Don't know an Edward Lane, do we?" "We know several," Purbright said. "They are the easiest sort of people to know." Miss Teesdale had come as far as the doorway and stopped, as if unwilling to be seen in proximity to what might turn out to be a narrative. "Inspector," she said, has he—" Purbright lifted the stick slightly. "He paid for it," he said, then left it to consider its position. Miss Teesdale's mouth tightened. "That," she pronounced, "is either very careless or very studied. In either case, I am against it." "Many people are against carelessness," Purbright said. "Study is more controversial." He returned the stick to his hands, and for the first time allowed his thumb to rest where the stranger's had rested, upon the silver band. He did not look at Miss Teesdale when he spoke next. "Miss Teesdale, did Mr. Mallow ever carry a walking stick?" "Occasionally," she said, "when he wished to look better informed than he was." "Ah, and his wife? Still at Harcourt Terrace?" "Number 9. Miss Teesdale said, fierce with accuracy. "She oversees a nephew since last autumn, a person of underachieving mustache." "Then I think," Purbright said, "we should take Mrs. Mallow the prize for utility poultry in my stead. Love will manage the announcement. We shall, of course, take the scenic route." Miss Teesdale blinked. "For what reason, Inspector?" "For the one we always use," Purbright said pleasantly, "to see who is already walking there." They went by way of Back Church Lane. The lane had not been designated a thoroughfare by any authority except the human foot. Behind the Mechanics' Institute, a low brick wall leaned conversationally into a patch of winter grass. On the other side, the churchyard held itself together with iron railings, and beyond the railings the stones tilted like letters in an old man's pocket. Love, who could not look at graves without looking for something he had lost there, found words to be brisk with. "We're not expecting him to be on his way out, sir." "Most of us are," Purbright said, "but not usually by this gate." They turned the corner into Harcourt Terrace, which behaved like a line of respectable teeth. Number 9 had a polished brass letterbox that suggested a steady supply of reading material. Before Purbright could ring, the door opened and Mrs. Lena Mallow looked out. She had the drained composure of a person who, having discovered that life will serve soup whether one orders it or not, had decided to tip the waiter only in exact change. "Yes," she said. It was not hostile. It was neat. "Mrs. Mallow," Purbright said, "I'm sorry to intrude during the enjoyments of utility poultry, but a small matter has fluttered into our path." Her gaze, quick as a sewing needle, went from the inspector to Miss Teesdale, whom she registered as a public inconvenience. and then to the walking stick. Something altered in her face. Not surprise, not grief, but a tightening that suggested the recollection of a bill one had meant to dispute and had, against one's better judgment, paid. "That," she said very evenly, "is not mine." "It isn't," Purbright agreed. "But it was, this afternoon, paid for by a gentleman who gave your address. She stopped. Her hands, which had been poised at the level of the letterbox as if ready to receive news and reject it simultaneously, lowered to her sides. "Edward Lane," Purbright said, and watched, not her face but the small, involuntary gesture of her left hand, which briefly touched her right sleeve as if ensuring that a frayed place was decently hidden. "Does the name signify?" Mrs. Mallow stood a second longer in the doorway, then stepped back to let them in as one admits weather. "Inspector," she said, "if I say no, I shall be thought obstructive. If I say yes, I shall be a woman with a past. I prefer to be neither, but since I cannot be neither, I will be brief." She led them into a parlour in which the furniture had the resolute modesty of old service. On the mantel, in a frame that would not have disgraced a more important portrait, there was a photograph of a man with the broad, unyielding cheerfulness of those who are well acquainted with the effect of their cheerfulness upon others. Purbright's eyes touched it and went away politely. Mrs. Mallow sat. "You will say this is absurd," she said with careful poise. "But Edward Lane is the name my husband used when he did not wish to be seen." Miss Teesdale made a sound that could by friends be mistaken for sympathy and, by others, for dust in the throat. Purbright did not look at the photograph. "Then he has very lately not wished to be seen," he said mildly, "because he has written it at the Mechanics' Institute in a hand that remembered it." Mrs. Mallow closed her eyes a moment as if counting something. When she opened them again, their calmness had been ironed. "My husband," she said, "was buried, Inspector. There was a service. There was gratitude to Mr. Pomfret. There was a stone." "Yes," Purbright agreed. He set the walking stick upright against the chair leg. The silver band flashed once and went dull. "And yet he appears to be out shopping." From the hallway came the faintest metallic rattle, like a teaspoon against a saucer in a cautious kitchen. Mrs. Mallow's gaze shifted, not away, but aside. "My nephew," she said, and did not call his name. Purbright rose without hurry. "If the young gentleman would not mind," he said gently, "asking the man in your scullery to wait where he is, I should be obliged. And if there is no man there, I shall be most interested to meet your nephew's teacup." For there was, beneath the orderly smell of beeswax and coal fire, another smell, a thin trace of river mud and carbolic, that did not belong to Harcourt Terrace at all. Mrs. Mallow's parlour seemed to contract around the faint rattle of crockery. The air, already thick with polish and coal dust memories, grew dense with expectation. Purbright did not move quickly. He had the talent of making hesitation appear like mastery of time. He simply turned his head a fraction, listening as though the house itself were about to confess. Sergeant Love shifted his weight, hands itching for something practical. "Would you like me to—" Purbright raised a hand, palm open. "We will not alarm anyone unnecessarily, Love. We might only frighten a teacup." His eyes, however, remained fixed on the narrow corridor leading to the scullery. Mrs. Mallow, stiff in her chair, pressed her hands together until the knuckles whitened. "I have already told you, Inspector, I want no trouble in this house." "Quite," Purbright said. He took 2 deliberate steps toward the doorway, each slow enough to be heard in the silence. "And I should be sorry to cause it, but we must sometimes choose between the trouble we allow and the trouble we prevent." The faint rattle stopped. Then a breath, unmistakably human, broke the hush. Love, unable to resist, moved forward. "Who's there?" he called, as though the scullery were a lost dog. The reply was not immediate. When it came, it was a cough. Rough, damp, the sort of cough that belonged more to a quay at midnight than a respectable terrace house. "Step out, if you please," Purbright said, still mild. "There's no advantage in shadows." A pause. Then the door to the scullery opened a crack. A figure emerged slowly. A young man, wiry, with the kind of nervous skin that never decided whether to grow pale or flush. His jacket smelled faintly of river mud and carbolic, as Purbright had already suspected. His hair was dark, plastered across his forehead as if he had recently bent his head beneath running water. In his right hand, he clutched a saucer. The teaspoon lay in the center like evidence. Mrs. Mallow drew in her breath. "Francis," she said sharply, "what on earth have you been doing?" The young man swallowed, glanced at her, then at the inspector. I was washing up." "In mud?" Purbright asked pleasantly. The boy's gaze dropped. "I slipped on the path behind the house, near the water butt. Got myself dirty." Purbright did not contradict him. He simply gestured to a chair. "Sit, if you would. We can listen to you better that way." Francis obeyed reluctantly, balancing the saucer on his knees as though it were a passport. His eyes flicked once to the walking stick leaning by Purbright's chair, and then away, with studied innocence. "Mr. Lane," Purbright said softly, and watched the boy flinch. "Or should I continue to call you Francis?" Mrs. Mallow rose, sudden as a match struck. "Inspector, my nephew has nothing to do with whatever foolishness you suspect. He is an orphan, with no means but my roof. He is impressionable, yes, but hardly." Purbright's expression remained one of politeness. "No doubt. Still, impressions are sometimes the clearer for being youthful. Tell me, Francis, do you often keep company with gentlemen at the Mechanics' Institute?" The boy's jaw worked. "I don't know what you mean." Love leaned forward, eager. "The chap with the stick. You saw him, didn't you? Looks a bit like Mr. Mallow, if you'll forgive the mention, ma'am." Mrs. Mallow stiffened further, but Purbright said nothing. He allowed the silence to pressure Francis more effectively than Love's words. At last, the boy muttered, "He told me not to say." "Then he must have thought you would be asked," Purbright said gently. "A curious precaution, wouldn't you say?" Francis licked his lips. He gave me money. Said I should carry a message, only I didn't understand it. Something about meeting where the bells used to be. I was to tell it to a woman if she asked." "The bells?" Purbright asked. Francis nodded miserably. "Old bell foundry by the canal. It's shut down. Been empty for years. People chuck rubbish in there now." Purbright allowed himself a thin smile. "A poetic choice of venue." He rose. "Mrs. Mallow, you may be reassured. Your nephew has not disgraced your hospitality. At least not yet. But it appears that someone else has been industrious in using him as a messenger." Mrs. Mallow sat down heavily, her composure leaking away like water through cloth. "Then it is true," she whispered. "He is alive." "Alive or very determined to persuade people he is," Purbright corrected gently. "The distinction is important." Love straightened, anxious for movement. "Shall we fetch him from this foundry place, sir?" "In due time, love." But men who arrange to be met are often more interested in who comes than in what is said. "We shall not disappoint him by arriving too promptly." Francis lifted his head suddenly, desperation in his voice. "You mustn't blame her. Aunt Lena had nothing to do with it. He came to me first, said the town had buried him too soon." Purbright looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "That is an accusation worth considering. For now, Francis, you will remain with your aunt. Do not carry any more messages, unless you prefer the kind written on police paper." The boy sagged with relief, though Mrs. Mallow's glance suggested his reprieve would be less comfortable than he imagined. Outside, the air of Harcourt Terrace was brisk with chimney smoke. Purbright and Love walked slowly back toward the market square, the walking stick once again in the inspector's hand. "Odd, isn't it, sir?" Love said. If Mr. Mallow really did drown, then who's this fellow walking about buying sticks? And if he didn't drown, well, how does a man escape his own funeral? Purbright's eyes rested on the stick's initials. There are few things more troublesome than the dead who refuse to stay politely absent. But you see, love, even ghosts prefer a stage. This foundry, bells that no longer ring, will do very well. They crossed into the square, where the produce show was winding down. The last chrysanthemums sagged under their own magnificence, and a few hens looked as if they regretted their public exposure. Gossip, however, was still in full bloom. Miss Teesdale had evidently broadcast her suspicions widely, for knots of townsfolk were already trading versions of the walking stick incident. Each version contradicted the others with admirable conviction. Purbright, hearing fragments, said nothing. He had long ago learned that gossip was like yeast. It rose better when left unattended. Instead, he paused by the police car, gazed at the silver band again, and remarked almost idly, "Do you recall, love, whether Mr. Mallow was insured?" Love frowned. "Wouldn't know, sir. But if he was, and he's turned up again, well, that'd make an insurance man choke on his biro." "Quite." Purbright slid the stick into the back seat as though storing a witness. "And that, love, is why I think our next call should be upon the local office of the Northern Prudence Mutual. They have a very long memory for signatures." The sergeant grinned. "And shorter patience for men who walk out of graves, eh?" Purbright closed the door. "One might say so, but let us not disturb their digestion yet. First, I want to see if anyone else has been invited to the bells." They drove slowly, the town unfolding around them in its familiar mixture of gossip and soot. Behind lace curtains, people were already rehearsing the tale of the dead man's return. Some swore he had walked straight past them, pale as a winding sheet. Others insisted it was only a cousin from the Midlands. In Flaxborough, certainty was the first casualty of rumour. As the car turned toward the station, Purbright allowed himself a single private reflection, that whatever truth lay beneath this business, it had chosen to step carefully back into town, carrying an old stick and a name that belonged to the drowned. And truths, when they walked back, rarely came alone. The inspector adjusted his hat, his face unreadable as the car rolled on. Suspense lingered in the streets like a fog, waiting for the next stir of footsteps near the canal's silent foundry. The Bell Foundry crouched by the canal as though ashamed of itself. Its roof sagged in two places, the slates gapped like missing teeth, and a bramble clambered over the rusted gates with all the patience of nature reclaiming a bad investment. The sign, Hollis and Sons, Church Bell Specialists, still faintly legible, had not been true for 30 years. Bells had long since given way to aluminium window frames, and even that enterprise had fled. What remained was a shell, echoing with its own past. Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love arrived just after 4 o'clock, a time when the town was still digesting its gossip. The square behind them buzzed with speculation about the stranger at the produce show, each repetition of the tale sprouting new flourishes like a prize marrow. Purbright had decided it was best to follow the scent while it was fresh. The canal beside the foundry lay dull as pewter, its surface occasionally pricked by the drift of a waterbird. A heron, exuding the long patience of its species, regarded the policeman from the far bank. "Cheerful spot, sir," Love muttered, pulling his coat tighter. "Looks like even the ghosts packed up and left." Purbright smiled faintly. "Then we may hope the living have it to themselves." He pushed at the gate. It gave way with a screech like a sermon delivered badly. Inside, the foundry yard was cluttered with the skeletons of machines, half buried in nettles. The air smelt of rust, mildew, and something less natural, a faint acrid tang, like smoke long since dispersed. They entered the main hall. High windows, dirt-furred, let in a dim yellow light. The floor was littered with plaster, pigeons' offerings, and a few crumpled newspapers whose dates had been washed away by damp. The molded pits in the ground, once cradles for molten bronze, now looked like graves. Love's boots scuffed loudly. Suppose he doesn't turn up? Could be we're standing here for nothing. Possibly, Purbright said. His voice was steady, but his eyes searched every beam, every dark arch where shadows seemed to thicken. But consider the invitation. Men do not send messages to empty buildings without an intention. The question is whether he expects company or an audience. They stood for some minutes, letting the silence settle. Then, faintly, came a sound. Not footsteps exactly, but the scrape of something wooden across stone. Both men turned toward the far end of the hall, where a narrow stairway rose to a gallery that overlooked the floor. "Stay here, love," Purbright said quietly. "No need for both of us to make introductions." Love, torn between loyalty and relief, nodded. "If you're sure, sir, I'll, He tapped the truncheon on his belt. "Keep ready." Purbright walked slowly across the hall, each footstep deliberate, unhurried. When he reached the base of the stairs, he looked up. A man stood on the gallery. His figure was half silhouetted by the jaundiced window light. He leaned upon the railing with one hand, the other holding something long and thin. Not quite a stick, perhaps an umbrella or cane. When he spoke, his voice carried down clearly. "You came." "Yes," Purbright said mildly, "though I am not the woman you expected." The man laughed softly without mirth. "Women always tell more than they mean to. Men, sometimes less." "Then you are Edward Lane?" The man tilted his head. "Names are slippery. Lane, Mallow, Ghost, Fraud. Choose one that suits your paperwork." Purbright's eyes did not leave him. "If you are Percival Mallow, the town has been mistaken for 2 years. If you are not, then someone has been industrious in borrowing his face." The man's grip tightened on the railing. "Faces are easy to borrow. It's lives that cost." For a moment, neither moved. The pigeons muttered in the rafters, shuffling on their beams. Then the man straightened. "Tell Mrs. Mallow she should not have betrayed me." Before Purbright could reply, the figure stepped back into shadow. The gallery door banged once, then silence. Love hurried across. "Did you get a good look at him, sir?" "Enough to know he meant to be seen," Purbright said. He mounted the stairs, but the gallery door beyond was already swinging open to the outside air. By the time they reached the yard, it stood empty. Only the brambles shivered faintly, as though recently disturbed. Love swore under his breath. "He's slippery as an eel, that one." Purbright crouched by the wall. A fresh scuff marked the brick where a boot had climbed. Beyond lay the towpath, and beyond that the whole unhelpful county. "He left us a statement," Purbright said. "Not of identity, but of grievance. A man who wants his betrayal known seldom intends to disappear altogether." They walked back to the car in thoughtful silence. That evening, the police station at Flaxborough saw a quiet stream of visitors. Each had heard a version of the afternoon's events, and each felt a duty to supplement it with additional invention. Mr. Crabbe, the florist, swore. He had seen the man buying pipe tobacco the week before. Mrs. Glossop insisted he was the image of her late brother-in-law, though he had died in Devon. A young clerk reported that the stranger had called at the post office for a telegram, though no telegram could be traced. Love grew increasingly bewildered. "They can't all be right, sir. Half of them must be imagining it." "Or all of them," Purbright said calmly. "But imagine carefully enough, and one sometimes recalls the truth by accident." It was nearly 10 when Purbright finally sent Love home and remained alone in his office. The walking stick rested on his desk, its silver band glinting faintly under the lamp. He turned it slowly in his hands, reflecting. PM, the initials could not be denied, nor the nick by the ferrule, which Mrs. Mallow herself had once confirmed. Yet the man's manner today had been deliberate theatre. He had chosen the foundry, spoken of betrayal, vanished into shadow. A performance for an audience that now included Inspector Purbright. At last he rose, placed the stick carefully in the evidence cabinet, and locked the door. Then he sat again, opened his notebook, and wrote 3 words: insurance, widow, bells. The following morning, Purbright paid a visit to the local office of Northern Prudence Mutual. The clerk, a young man with hair parted as though by geometry, greeted him with eager formality. "Inspector, good morning. How may we?" Purbright produced his card. "I should like to inquire about Mr. Percival Mallow, drowned at Skegness 2 summers ago. There was, I believe, a policy." The clerk's eyes brightened, the way clerks' eyes do when they smell both duty and gossip. "Yes, indeed, Inspector, a substantial one. Paid to the widow after due process. You'd like to see the file?" "If you would be so kind." The file was produced with reverence. Purbright leafed through it. Medical certificates, witness statements, photographs of the drowned man's effects. And finally, the insurance claim signed by Mrs. Lena Mallow, neat and unsentimental. He studied the signature. Then he studied the witness statement of a fisherman at Skegness who had identified the body. It was brief, factual, unembellished. The body had been in the water some days, but the clothes and certain distinguishing marks had confirmed the identity. "Was there any hesitation at the time?" Purbright asked. The clerk pursed his lips. "Not officially, though I heard privately that Mr. Pomfret, the undertaker, advised against an open coffin. The sea does not always restore what it borrows." Purbright closed the file. "Thank you. Most helpful." Outside he paused in the cold air of the high street. The town went about its morning rituals. Shop shutters clattering open, milk bottles clinking on doorsteps. But to Purbright, each sound seemed faintly off-key, like an orchestra tuning before a discordant performance. If the drowned man had been misidentified, then someone had profited handsomely by it. If the drowned man had been genuine, then who now walked the streets with his face and his stick? And above all, why had Francis been dragged into the business with talk of betrayal at the bells? As he walked back to the station, a fresh thought came. The widow herself. Her composure yesterday had cracked only briefly, but behind it was steel. If anyone knew the truth of Mallow's fate, it was surely Lena. And if she had concealed it once, she might do so again. That afternoon, Purbright and Love returned to Harcourt Terrace. Mrs. Mallow received them in her parlour with a politeness that was half defiance. "Inspector," she said, "I have nothing to add. My husband is dead. I saw the coffin lowered into the ground. If some charlatan uses his name, that is not my concern." "Yet he used your address," Purbright pointed out gently. "That suggests more than a coincidence." Her gaze did not waver. "It suggests cruelty. Someone wishes to torment me." "Or to remind you," Purbright said. At that, for the first time, her eyes faltered. Just slightly, but enough. Purbright pressed no further. He rose, inclined his head, and allowed Love to follow him out. On the pavement outside, Love asked, "What do you make of her, sir?" Purbright considered. "A woman with secrets. Perhaps not the ones we assume, but secrets nonetheless." They walked slowly toward the station again, and behind them, at the upstairs window of number 9, a curtain shifted just enough to suggest that Francis was watching, wide-eyed, pale, and trapped between loyalty and fear. The mystery had thickened, not loosened, and somewhere, in the shadows of Flaxborough, a man calling himself Edward Lane was preparing the next move. The week slipped forward with the unhurried gait of small-town life, but underneath its familiar shuffle lay the low hum of unease. Word of the dead man's return had grown into its own mythology. By Tuesday evening, Flaxborough was full of him. He had been sighted in the co-op queue buying tea. glimpsed near the railway bridge at dusk, and recognized, with uncanny certainty, in the face of a passing commercial traveler. The stories overlapped, contradicted, and flourished in the way only gossip could, until the man was both everywhere and nowhere at once. Inspector Purbright knew better than to stifle it. Gossip was a kind of smoke. Choke it, and it thickened. Leave it to drift, and eventually it revealed where the fire was. He let the stories run while he and Sergeant Love worked in quieter ways. On Wednesday morning, they visited the churchyard. The winter grass was thin and flattened, the stones leaning with the weary determination of pensioners. The grave of Percival Mallow lay in the second row, its headstone new enough to look faintly embarrassed among its mossy elders. The inscription read with simple piety, "Beloved husband, faithful friend." Purbright studied it, then stooped to examine the turf. The earth had settled evenly, no sign of recent disturbance. He tapped the headstone gently with his knuckle. Love, watching uneasily, asked, "You're not thinking someone's dug him up, are you, sir?" "No," Purbright said. "If they had, the gravedigger would already be dining out on the tail." He straightened. "But there is a certain finality to stone and earth. When one is told the dead are walking, it is useful to remind oneself that they are also lying still." Love blinked at this, unsure whether to nod in agreement or wait for further explanation. They left the churchyard and followed the narrow lane toward the canal. The old foundry stood sullen in the daylight, pigeons wheeling overhead. Purbright paused at the gate again, gazing at the rust and bramble. "He invited us here," he murmured. Yet he showed himself only briefly, enough to tantalize, a man who seeks notice but not capture. "Why?" Love offered the obvious. "Because he's guilty, sir." "Of what, Love?" "Of dying inconveniently, of coming back. A guilty man hides. This one performs." As they turned away, a small figure came trotting down the towpath. Miss Teesdale, wrapped in a coat of formidable tweed, her expression sharpened by duty. She hailed them with the air of a town crier. "Inspector, you may be interested to know that last night Mrs. Mallow received a visitor. I happened to be returning from my committee meeting and observed a man of medium height and deliberate manner entering her house." Purbright's brows lifted slightly. "At what hour, Miss Teesdale?" 10 minutes past 8. I have an excellent watch." "And did he leave?" Miss Teesdale pursed her lips. "I cannot say, but the curtains were drawn and I distinctly heard a raised voice. Hers, unmistakably. I've lived too long beside hypocrisy not to recognize its pitch." "Your vigilance is invaluable," Purbright said gravely, "though I must beg you, for your own peace, not to place yourself too near the windows of your neighbors." Her eyes flashed. "Someone must keep an eye, Inspector. Some of us believe in civic responsibility." Purbright inclined his head. "And civilization thanks you for it." When she had marched off, Love muttered, "Do you reckon it was him, sir?" Paying his widow a visit. "Possibly," Purbright said, "though Miss Teesdale's medium height covers 2/3 of the male population. Still, a quarrel behind curtains is always promising." That afternoon, Purbright called at Harcourt Terrace once more. Mrs. Mallow received him with an air of cool resistance, her black dress buttoned with precision. "I'm growing weary of these interruptions, Inspector," she said. "I've told you all I can. Must a widow be harassed because idle tongues wag?" "I regret the intrusion," Purbright said gently. "But I hear you had a caller last night." Her eyes flickered, then steadied. "Who told you that?" "Miss Teesdale. That woman is a menace. She peers from behind curtains like a stage prompter. Nevertheless, did someone come?" Mrs. Mallow hesitated. "A gentleman called. He wished to speak about certain investments my husband once made. He was mistaken in thinking I knew more than I do." "And his name?" "I did not ask. I had no wish to prolong the visit." Purbright's gaze rested on her face, reading the careful stillness. "And did he mention bells?" Her hands, folded neatly in her lap, tightened just enough for the knuckles to whiten. "He spoke in riddles," she said at last. "Something about old debts ringing again. I told him I wanted none of it and asked him to leave." "Did he?" "Yes, by the back door." Purbright inclined his head. "Then I thank you for your patience. If he returns, will you inform me?" She gave a small, brittle smile. "If he returns, Inspector, I shall do much more than that." They left her to her silence. On the pavement, Love asked, "What do you reckon she meant by that?" "That she is more frightened than she cares to admit," Purbright said, "and that fear sometimes sharpens resolve into something else." The next day brought a fresh disturbance. A bargeman reported to the police that he had seen a man standing on the canal towpath at midnight near the foundry. The man had signalled with a lantern as though expecting a reply, then vanished into the shadows. Purbright went to the site at once. The mud showed a fresh boot print, narrow and pointed. He crouched, studied it, then straightened. "Too careful to be an accident," he murmured. "He wants us to know he is here. A ghost who insists on footprints." That evening, Purbright convened a quiet meeting in his office with Love and Constable Mallow. The walking stick lay on the desk between them, its silver band catching the lamplight. "Gentlemen," Purbright said, "we have 3 possibilities. 1. That Mr. Mallow did not drown and has returned for reasons we must uncover. 2. That someone has assumed his likeness to frighten or extort. 3. That we are dealing with a conspiracy in which Mrs. Mallow herself is not entirely unwilling. Each requires consideration." Love frowned. "But, sir, if he really is Mallow, then what's he after? Why turn up now?" Purbright tapped the stick. "Perhaps because money runs out, or revenge grows stronger with time, or because he wants the town to know it has been deceived. Whatever the motive, he cannot resist being seen." Mallow, earnest as always, asked, "Should we guard the widow's house, sir?" "Discreetly," Purbright said. "We must watch not only who goes in, but who chooses to be seen going in. Our visitor likes an audience." And so, the following evening, Love positioned himself discreetly in a doorway opposite Harcourt Terrace, while Purbright remained at the station, reviewing papers. The town grew dark, windows glowed, and the cold deepened. At 8:30, Love stiffened. A figure approached from the corner, the same medium height, the same deliberate gait. He carried no lantern now, but the streetlight caught his pale face for an instant before he lifted a collar to conceal it. He paused at number 9, glanced once over his shoulder, and slipped inside. Love waited, heart pounding. He could storm in, but Purbright's instructions were clear. Observe first. 20 minutes passed. Then half an hour. At last, the door opened again. The man emerged, coat buttoned, and walked swiftly away toward the canal. Love hurried back to the station with the report. Purbright listened in silence, then asked, "Did you note anything distinctive?" "Only—" Love hesitated. He walked with a slight limp, left leg dragging just a touch. "Funny, I hadn't noticed it before." Purbright's eyes narrowed. "Interesting. Mr. Mallow in life was said to limp from an old injury, but so might an imitator who knew enough to play the part." He rose, fetched his hat. "Come, Love. Let us see where our ghost prefers to haunt when the hour grows late." They followed the towpath under the thin moonlight, boots crunching frost. Ahead, the derelict foundry loomed like a blackened tooth against the sky. A faint glimmer of light moved within. They halted, listening. Voices carried faintly, one low and measured, the other sharp, female. Purbright's eyes met Love's. "Mrs. Mallow," he whispered. They crept closer. Through a gap in the broken boards, they glimpsed the scene inside. The pale-faced man stood by the gallery rail, gesturing with intensity. Below, Lena Mallow faced him, her arms folded, her posture proud and unyielding. "You should never have come back," she said clearly, her voice trembling with anger. "Better for both of us if you had stayed drowned," the man laughed harshly. "And let you enjoy the money without question." "No, Lena, I want what is mine, or I shall have the town know the truth of how you helped bury me alive." Purbright felt love tense beside him. The inspector's eyes, calm as ever, rested on the pair. "So," he murmured, "the ghost does not merely haunt. He negotiates." And in that moment, with the cold canal glimmering behind them, the case shifted again. The dead man's return was no longer rumor. It was bargaining, blackmail, and something deeper, coiled in the shadows of Flaxborough, waiting to be uncovered. The foundry's shadows seemed to breathe as Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love remained hidden behind the broken boarding. The exchange between Mrs. Mallow and the pale-faced man above them carried clearly in the hollow air, words bouncing off the rusted beams and pigeon-haunted rafters. "You speak as though you own me," Lena Mallow said. Her voice was low, but each word carried the weight of 2 years of guarded silence. "Yet you were the one who vanished, the one who let me bear the disgrace, the pitying looks, the whispered speculation. I buried what was left of you, Percival, or whoever you choose to be now. I gave you peace. Why disturb it?" The man, Lane, Mallow, Ghost, whatever name he bore, laughed again, bitter as coal smoke. "Peace? You profited from my death, the insurance, the sympathy, the freedom, and now you'd keep it all, as though the past were tidy." He leaned forward over the rail, his pale features sharpening in the half-light. "I want what is mine, a share. Call it a resurrection fee, if you like." Purbright's eyes narrowed, but he did not yet stir. He sensed there was more to be heard, more that must be said before intervention would have any effect. Mrs. Mallow's arms folded tighter. "You left me nothing but debt, Percival. Your investments were folly, your dealings dubious. If the insurance paid me something, it was no more than compensation for the indignity of being married to a man who believed bluster could pass for virtue." Lane's expression hardened. "Careful, Lena. You wouldn't want me to tell the town what really happened at Skegness. How convenient it was, wasn't it, that I should vanish into the sea and you should so swiftly recognize the body?" Purbright noted the tremor that crossed Mrs. Mallow's face then. It was not fear alone, but memory, the involuntary shudder of someone revisiting a night they had long tried to fold away. "You're lying," she whispered. "Am I?" Lane's voice rose, echoing in the vast chamber. "You stood on that pier, Lena. You watched me stagger in the surf, and you walked away. You knew well enough that no rescue would come." Silence fell, punctuated only by the drip of canal water seeping through some unseen crack. Purbright could feel Love's breath quicken beside him. "Shall we go in, sir?" the sergeant whispered. "Not yet," Purbright murmured. "The truth, like certain wines, must breathe before it is poured." Inside, Lena lifted her chin. "If you drowned that night, Percival, it was of your own making. You were drunk, you were reckless, and you shouted threats I will not repeat. If I walked away, it was because you had already gone too far out. The sea did the rest. What came back in that coffin was unrecognizable, but it was yours." Lane's hand gripped the rail. "Then explain me, Lena. Explain the man who stands here now, with the scar on his hand you once kissed, with the limp you once pitied. Explain the voice that knew your secrets before Francis was even born." At the mention of her nephew, Mrs. Mallow stiffened. "Leave him out of this. He knows nothing." Lane smiled thinly. "Oh, but he does. I made sure of it. A boy's tongue is a useful tool. He carried my message well enough. Soon he'll carry more." It was at this moment that Purbright stepped forward, pushing the board aside with deliberate noise. The hollow clap of his boots on the foundry floor startled both figures into silence. Love followed, truncheon drawn but uncertain where to point it. "Good evening," Purbright said mildly, as though entering a vicar's tea party. I should apologize for eavesdropping, but the acoustics here are so obliging. Lane straightened on the gallery. Inspector. His tone was half challenge, half weary amusement. I wondered when you'd appear. You never could resist a performance. True, Purbright said, but only when the actors forget their lines. You claim to be Percival Mallow returned from the sea. Mrs. Mallow here seems uncertain whether you are man or ghost. Perhaps you might clarify matters for us. Lane's eyes glittered. What would you do with the truth, Inspector? Arrest it? Write it in your ledger? No. You prefer to leave it floating, where you can tug it ashore when it suits you. Possibly, Purbright allowed. But my difficulty lies not with your existence, but with your intentions. You have chosen to haunt your widow, your nephew, and indeed the entire town. Why? Lane leaned forward. Because I was wronged. Because Lena and her respectable neighbors buried me before my time. Because I want payment for 2 stolen years. Payment, Purbright repeated softly. Always an unsentimental word, even from the grave. He turned to Mrs. Mallow. And you, madam? What would you say to this claim? Her eyes were cold, but her hands trembled. I say that whoever this man is, he is not my husband. My husband is in the ground where he belongs. This is an impostor, a trickster, preying on grief. Lane's laugh rang out. Then come closer, Lena. Look into my face and say that again. But she did not move. Instead, she turned to Purbright, her composure cracking. Inspector, please, take him away. He frightens me. He frightens Francis. He will not stop. Purbright nodded once. Very well. Mr. Lane, or Mallow, whichever name you prefer, I must ask you to accompany us to the station. You may explain your grievances there, with fewer pigeons to overhear. Lane hesitated, his knuckles white on the rail. For a moment it seemed he might leap, flee, vanish again into the canal shadows. But then, with a weary shrug, he descended the stairs, his limp pronounced now as though to underline his claim. Love stepped forward with handcuffs, but Purbright raised a hand. No need for melodrama, Love. Our guest has agreed to walk. And so, under the thin winter moon, they escorted the man back through the towpath to the waiting car. Mrs. Mallow remained behind in the foundry, her face turned away, her figure rigid in the half-light like a statue unwilling to speak. At the station, Purbright seated Lane in the interview room, offered him tea, and waited. Lane declined the tea, but accepted the chair with sardonic grace. You think you can prove me false, he said, but you cannot. Too many people have seen me. Too many remember my gait, my voice, even my stick returned to me, though you confiscated it. Purbright regarded him mildly. Proof is seldom so cooperative, it tends to prefer contradictions. For instance, the fisherman who identified your body at Skegness. He remembered a scar on the left arm. You display none. Lane's lips curved. Seawater erases many things, but not everything. He held out his right hand, revealing the pale scar across the knuckle. She remembers this. Ask her. Purbright made a note in his ledger. And yet, he continued, the insurance was paid without protest. If you are Mallow, you benefited from fraud. If you are not, you conspire to commit it. Either way, the law requires attention. Lane leaned back, eyes glinting. But will the town thank you, Inspector, for stripping away its favorite ghost? They enjoy me, you see. They need the thrill. Without me, Flaxborough is only chrysanthemums and poultry shows. Purbright closed his notebook gently. Perhaps. But I find it is safer for the living if their ghosts are kept in orderly places. When Lane was finally placed in a cell, Love asked, Do you believe him, sir? Is he really Mallow? Purbright removed his spectacles, polished them carefully. I believe he wants us to believe. That is not the same thing. The truth will not be found in his words, Love, but in the silences around them, particularly the silence of Mrs. Mallow. Until she speaks plainly, we walk in fog. Love sighed. And if she never does? Then, Purbright said, we wait for the fog to lift. It always does in time. But sometimes it reveals more than the landscape one expected. As they left the cells, a constable hurried in with fresh news. Inspector, there's been another disturbance. Someone's broken into the undertaker's yard. A coffin lid has been forced open. Purbright's face did not change, but his eyes darkened. Which coffin? Mr. Mallow's, sir. Love paled. Then either someone wants to prove he's alive, or prove he's not. Purbright nodded slowly. Either way, love, the dead refuse to stay where we put them. And with that, the case shifted again. From whispered hauntings to desecration, from rumor to scandal. The town of Flaxborough was about to learn that a dead man's return can disturb not only the living, but the very ground beneath which they thought him safely contained. The undertaker's yard lay quiet in the hour before dawn, though its stillness was not the comfortable hush of sleep, but the kind that follows an unwelcome visitor. Frost crusted the gravel, crunching beneath Purbright's careful steps as he and Sergeant Love entered through the side gate. A constable's lantern swung ahead of them, throwing pale arcs over rows of stacked coffins and ironwork. Mr. Pomfret, the undertaker, stood waiting by the far shed. His habitual air of solemn detachment had acquired a trace of irritation, as though even the dead ought to keep proper hours. He inclined his head when Purbright approached, then gestured toward the shed door. In here, Inspector. I dislike disturbance, as you know, but this one is particularly graceless. The shed smelled faintly of varnish and earth. Inside, the lid of one coffin lay askew, its nails prized out with crude haste. Sawdust littered the floor where careless hands had scraped at the wood. The coffin bore a brass plate. Percival Mallow, 1909 to 1963. Love sucked in his breath. They've gone and opened him up, sir. Lord save us. Purbright leaned closer, his gaze fixed not on the coffin itself, but on the marks around it. Splintered edges, footprints in the dust, the faint smear of mud across the boards. The interior was empty. No body, he said quietly. Pomfret folded his hands with professional calm. It was here, Inspector. I supervised its lowering myself 2 summers past. Whatever else I may forget, I do not misplace my clients. Love frowned. But if he was in there, sir, then where's he gone? Don't tell me the fellow we've got in the cells dug himself out. Purbright shook his head. Corpses are seldom so enterprising, but others may find profit in their relocation. He traced a finger along the mud smear. See here, love. This earth is from the canal bank, not from the churchyard. Whoever opened this coffin was recently at the water's edge. Pomfret cleared his throat. You imply, Inspector, that the dead man may not have been quite so dead. Forgive me if I express doubt. The body I saw was past all resurrection. Nevertheless, Purbright murmured, it has apparently walked again. They left the shed as the first pale wash of morning seeped across the rooftops. Flaxborough was stirring, milk carts rattling, curtains twitching. By the time they returned to the station, rumor had already outrun them. Mrs. Glossop's niece had heard from a reliable source that Mallow's grave was empty. Mr. Crabbe, the florist, declared that he had seen the coffin dragged through the high street. Each retelling embroidered the scandal until the dead man was as lively as any resident. In the interview room, Lane, or Mallow, awaited them, seated with irritating composure. He raised his brows when Purbright entered. You've discovered my absence, I take it. Purbright studied him without reply, then said, Mr. Lane, would you care to explain why your coffin is empty? A slow smile spread across Lane's face. Perhaps because I was never in it. Perhaps because someone else went to the ground in my place. Or perhaps, he added with mock solemnity, because the dead dislike confinement. Love bristled. You think this is funny, do you? Graves opened, coffins smashed? Lane shrugged. Humor is in the eye of the living, Sergeant. Purbright seated himself opposite, folding his hands neatly on the table. Who then, if not you, lies at the bottom of the sea at Skegness? A stranger? A friend? A debt conveniently drowned? Lane leaned forward, eyes glittering. Does it matter? The town buried a body and called it Mallow. Now the town sees Mallow walk again. That is enough. Purbright let the silence lengthen, the tick of the clock filling the space. Then he said softly, unless, of course, the body was never there at all. Unless you arranged for Pomfret to bury an empty box. Lane chuckled. Ah, Inspector, you do me too much credit. You think me capable of deceiving half the town, an insurance company, and a wife with sharper eyes than most. If I were so clever, I should be Prime Minister. Or an undertaker, Purbright said mildly. Lane's expression flickered, only slightly, but enough for Purbright to note it. Later, in his office, Love asked, Do you think he's in league with Pomfret, sir? Unlikely. Pomfret's devotion to propriety leaves little room for theatrics, but he may have been deceived as others were. Purbright tapped his pen thoughtfully. What interests me is the precise benefit. Who gains from Mallow's ambiguous status, dead or alive? The widow with her insurance, Lane with his blackmail, or someone else altogether? The answer did not come that day. Instead, another disturbance rippled through the town. Francis, the nephew, was found wandering near the canal at dusk, his clothes damp and his eyes wide with fright. A constable brought him to the station, where he sat shivering in Purbright's office. I didn't mean to, Inspector, he stammered. He told me to meet him. Said he had something to show me. But when I got there, at the foundry, there was nothing. Just an open coffin. And then I heard footsteps and I ran. Purbright regarded him kindly. Which he, Francis? Mr. Lane? Francis nodded miserably. Yes. He said if I was brave, he'd tell me the truth. But I couldn't stay. You were wise to run, Purbright said gently. Bravery is sometimes better exercised in retreat. When Francis had been sent home, Love shook his head. Poor lad's being used like a messenger pigeon. That Lane's got him dancing to his tune. Perhaps, Purbright said. Or perhaps Francis knows more than he realizes. Children overhear truths adults try to bury. He may yet provide the missing piece. That night, Purbright walked alone to the churchyard. The mist lay thick, muffling the stones, blurring their edges. He paused by Mallow's grave, gazing at the earth that covered nothing. The brass plate caught the moonlight faintly, an inscription without substance. Dead, yet not dead, he murmured. A useful condition for those who wish to unsettle the living. Behind him a voice said, Talking to the departed, Inspector? They seldom reply. It was Mr. Pomfret, materializing as silently as ever. He stood with his hands clasped, the moon silvering his narrow features. Mr. Pomfret, Purbright said, perhaps you can satisfy a curiosity. When you buried Mr. Mallow, did you see his face? Pomfret's pause was slight but telling. I advised against viewing. The sea inspector is unkind to flesh. The widow accepted my counsel. The coffin was closed. Then you relied on the fisherman's word. And on the widow's. Purbright inclined his head. 2 witnesses, neither infallible, which leaves us with a puzzle. If the coffin was empty, who arranged it? If it was not, then who removed its contents? Pomfret's expression did not change. The living are always less reliable than the dead. At least the dead do not alter their stories. Unless, Purbright said quietly, someone alters their resting place. When he left the churchyard, the fog clung to his coat, the chill pressing deeper than the air alone. The town slept, but its sleep was uneasy, stirred by whispers of an empty coffin and a man who had returned where he should not be. Back at the station, Purbright wrote in his ledger, Questions. Who profited from Mallow's death? Who profits from his return? What role does Francis play? Why desecrate the coffin now? He closed the book, his face unreadable. Outside, the bells of St. Michael's struck midnight, faint, cracked, but insistent, as though to remind him that time was passing, and ghosts, however troublesome, waited for no man. The next morning promised another revelation, for rumor had already begun that someone, perhaps a workman, perhaps a child, had glimpsed two figures arguing near the canal, one the pale-faced man with the limp, the other a woman with unmistakable dark hair pinned in a widow's coil. And if that were true, then the mystery of the dead man's return was far from over. It was only just beginning to toll its louder, more dangerous bells. By the next evening, Flaxborough felt like a theatre in which half the town was determined to play a role. Shopkeepers leaned over counters to whisper to customers, council clerks loitered in corridors rather than face their ledgers, and Miss Teesdale of the public library had apparently promoted herself to town herald. She stood outside the grocer's that afternoon, telling anyone who would pause long enough that she had definitive knowledge the dead man was alive and the living widow was to blame. The matter had ceased to be private scandal. It had swollen into civic entertainment. Inspector Purbright, however, viewed the play with the wary patience of a man who suspected the finale might not please the audience. He sat in his office that evening, gazing at the walking stick on his desk. The initials, modestly engraved, seemed to mock him. PM could stand for Percival Mallow, or for anything else in a town that adored initials and abbreviations as badges of respectability. Sergeant Love, fidgeting in the chair opposite, broke the silence. "Sir, if he's not Mallow, then who is he? We've had him in the cells 2 days now, and he hasn't slipped once. Talks as though he knows the whole family history, down to the dog they had in 58 Purbright tapped the desk gently. Knowledge can be borrowed. What interests me is not what he knows, but what he chooses to leave unsaid. He has avoided one subject altogether, where he went for those 2 years. If he truly drowned, there is no explanation. If he lived, there must be one. A gap that wide is seldom empty. It is filled with something men prefer hidden." Before Love could reply, a constable entered, cap in hand. "Message, sir, from Harcourt Terrace. Mrs. Mallow requests you call at once. She says she has information." Purbright rose at once, sliding the stick back into the cabinet. "Love, fetch your coat. When widows decide to speak, it is usually because silence has turned against them." Mrs. Mallow received them in her parlour, though this time she had not arranged herself like a portrait. She stood by the fire, hands restless, face drawn. Francis sat hunched in a corner, pale and anxious. The air smelled faintly of damp wool and coal smoke. "Inspector," she began, her voice tighter than before, "I cannot endure this any longer. He has been here again, not in this house, but near it, standing at the corner, waiting. And last night," she faltered, casting a quick glance at Francis. "Last night he left a note." She handed Purbright a folded slip of paper. The writing was tidy, deliberate. "Lena, you cannot deny me. Meet me once more at the bells, or I will tell the town what you did at Skegness." P. Love whistled softly. "Bells again, sir. Same as the boy said." Purbright pocketed the note. "And what did you do, Mrs. Mallow?" She pressed her lips together. "I burned the first note, but this one I kept, because I know he will not stop. If you want him, Inspector, you will find him there tonight." Francis stirred miserably. "Aunt, please don't go. He frightens you. He frightens me." Purbright regarded the boy gently. "You need not be involved, Francis. But you may have noticed something your aunt has not. Think carefully. When this man spoke to you at the foundry, did he say anything at all that seemed borrowed? A phrase your uncle never used?" Francis bit his lip. He said the town buried him too soon. Uncle used to say the town never buried anyone soon enough. Purbright's eyes flickered with interest. A small slip, but sometimes the small ones trip us hardest. Thank you, Francis. He turned back to Mrs. Mallow. We shall attend the foundry tonight. You will remain here, with company if you wish. Allow us to meet him at the bells. She nodded, relief mingled with something darker, perhaps fear of what the meeting would reveal. The foundry looked even more sinister in moonlight than it had by day. Frost glittered on the iron railings, and the canal lay still, reflecting the stars like a cracked mirror. Purbright and Love approached silently, their breaths visible in the cold air. Inside, the great hall loomed, rafters black against the dim glow seeping through broken windows. They waited in shadow. Time ticked. At last, a sound. Footsteps, careful and measured, entering from the far side. The figure appeared with lantern in hand, its glow throwing his face into stark relief. Lane, or Mallow, limped toward the center of the hall, looking about as if certain someone waited. "You've come, Lena," he said aloud. His voice echoed harshly. "I knew you would." Purbright stepped forward. "Not Lena, I'm afraid. Though perhaps I will do." The man froze, the lantern shaking. "Inspector." "Yes," Purbright said calmly. "Your audience, as ever. You wished to speak of Skegness. Perhaps now you will be specific." The man's jaw tightened. "She knows what she did. She watched me drown." "Did she?" Purbright asked mildly. "Or did she watch another drown while you arranged your disappearance?" The lantern flame wavered. "You cannot prove that." "Perhaps not yet. But you make one error, sir. You forget that silence is a kind of speech. Mrs. Mallow has said much by what she refuses to say, and Francis, too, has given you away without intending." The true Mallow loved to contradict Flaxborough. He never claimed the town buried anyone too soon, quite the opposite. Yet you, in your eagerness, borrowed the wrong memory. For a moment, the man looked stricken. Then he laughed harshly. "So clever, Inspector. But if I am not Mallow, who am I? Some ghost conjured by gossip? The town believes me. Perhaps belief is all that matters." Purbright stepped closer, voice steady. "Belief may keep a rumor alive, but it cannot keep you out of prison. Who paid you to play this role? Who profits if the insurance is questioned, the widow disgraced, the town unsettled?" The man's face darkened. "Ask your undertaker. Ask Pomfret. He knows what was in that coffin." And with sudden violence he hurled the lantern to the ground. Flame licked across the dust, sparks catching in scraps of paper. Love lunged forward, stamping furiously. Purbright moved to block the fugitive, but the man darted sideways, limping yet swift, and vanished through a gap in the boards. By the time they reached the yard, he was gone into the darkness along the towpath. Love cursed, brushing ash from his trousers. "Slipped us again, sir. He's like smoke." "Smoke leaves a smell," Purbright said calmly, gazing after the vanished figure. "And this one has told us where to sniff. Pomfret, indeed. Interesting that he should name the undertaker, either to accuse or to distract. Both are valuable." The following morning, Purbright called discreetly at Pomfret's premises. The undertaker, polishing a coffin handle, received him with his usual serenity. "Inspector, come to arrange something?" "Not quite," Purbright replied. "I come with a question. When you buried Mr. Mallow, you advised against viewing the body. Why?" Pomfret inclined his head. "Because the sea had been unkind. The features were compromised. Out of respect for the widow, I recommended the coffin remain closed." "And you were certain it was Mallow?" "As certain as one may be when the sea and time have interfered. The clothing was his. The widow confirmed the mark on his arm. Beyond that, one can only trust." "Or deceive," Purbright said softly. Pomfret's expression did not alter. "Inspector, my profession relies on dignity. I do not trade in illusions." Purbright studied him a moment longer, then nodded. Perhaps not, but someone does, and they are using your authority as part of their disguise. As he left, Purbright felt the first threads of clarity tugging at the knot. Whoever Lane truly was, his knowledge of Mallow's habits was borrowed, his scar and limp rehearsed. The coffin's emptiness was not proof of resurrection, but of manipulation, and at the center of it, either complicit or deceived, stood the widow and the undertaker, the two people who had last authority over the body of Percival Mallow. Back at the station, he told Love, "We are dealing not with a ghost, but with a production. Someone wrote this play. Someone cast this man in the role. The question is, who benefits from the performance?" Love scratched his head. If it's the widow, she's got the money already. If it's Pomfret, he's got enough business without raising the dead. Who else is there? Purbright closed his ledger. That, Love, is what we shall learn. Tonight we will let the bells toll once more. For whoever truly choreographs this drama will not resist attending the final act. And as the frost deepened across Flaxborough, the stage was set for another confrontation at the foundry, where the truth, still hidden among shadows and whispers, prepared to show its face at last. Night in Flaxborough always carried a faint suggestion of conspiracy, as though the gas lamps were in league with the curtains to keep secrets from the street. That evening, however, the atmosphere thickened into something closer to anticipation. The produce show had been forgotten, council business neglected, and in several parlours, groups of neighbours whispered the same words. The bells. Even those who had never set foot near the derelict foundry now claimed to have known all along that it was the stage for uncanny happenings. Inspector Purbright walked the towpath with the unhurried tread of a man who knew haste rarely improved matters. Sergeant Love trudged beside him, muffled in a scarf, eyes darting toward the dark water. "Sir," Love muttered, "I'll say it plain. I don't like this. We've had near a week of shadows and whispers, and all the while that fellow limps about as though daring us to catch him. It's like chasing smoke." "Smoke," Purbright said mildly, "eventually leads one to fire. Let us hope the embers are still warm enough to illuminate the truth." The foundry rose before them, vast and broken-backed against the winter sky. Through gaps in the roof, stars winked like spectators peering into a theatre. A faint glimmer of light seeped from the high gallery windows. Not steady, but the intermittent glow of a lantern shifted in restless hands. Inside, the air was damp, smelling of iron and mildew. Pigeons shuffled uneasily above, as though aware the place was too crowded with human drama. Lane, or the man claiming to be Mallow, stood once more at the gallery rail. The lantern at his side painted his features in pale strokes, sharpening the hollows beneath his eyes. He appeared less ghostly than weary, but no less determined to be seen. "You're punctual, Inspector," he called down. "One might almost think you wished to believe me." Purbright's gaze lifted, steady. "Belief is a dangerous indulgence, Mr. Lane. I prefer evidence, though you are obliging enough to provide both performance and audience." From the shadows at the side of the hall, another figure emerged. Lena Mallow, cloaked and stiff-backed, stepped into the light. Her presence drew a soft gasp from Love. "Mrs. Mallow," Purbright said gently, "I advised you to remain at home." "I will not be hunted in my own house," she answered. "If he demands to face me, then I shall not hide. Better here, Inspector, where you may hear all, than whispered through doors and curtains." Lane leaned forward over the rail, eyes alight. "That's the woman I knew, proud, defiant, until the sea silenced me. And yet you buried me, Lena, and pocketed the spoils." Lena's face tightened. "I buried a body. I did what was expected, and I endured the pity of neighbors who never pitied me while I lived with you." Purbright lifted a hand. "Perhaps we may dispense with theatrical declarations. Mr. Lane, if you are Mallow, then prove it here and now. Tell your wife something only her husband could know." The man hesitated. His eyes flickered as though scanning a script. Then he said slowly, "The brooch, the silver one you hid in the bureau. You said it was from your mother, but I knew it was from another man." Lena's composure cracked for the first time. She flinched as though struck, her hand rising involuntarily toward her collar. Love muttered, "Well, that sounds like proof enough." But Purbright's eyes remained narrowed. "Curious," he said softly, "for I once examined that bureau myself after a petty burglary 3 years ago. The brooch was reported stolen, Mrs. Mallow, was it not?" Lena's lips parted, but no sound emerged. "And yet," Purbright continued, turning his gaze back to the figure above, "our visitor speaks of it as if it still lay hidden, which means he did not know of the theft, or he invented the tale to wound you. In either case, it is not the certainty he would have us believe." Lane's face darkened. "You twist everything, Inspector. You cannot bear to accept what is plain. I am Percival Mallow, and I have returned for what is mine." Purbright's voice, calm but cutting, carried through the hall. "And what is that exactly? Not love, not reputation, only money, which suggests you are not a ghost at all, but a debtor with a mask." At that moment, another sound intruded, the crunch of feet on gravel outside, followed by the sharp crack of the outer door. Into the hall stepped Mr. Pomfret, undertaker's lantern in hand. His presence, quiet but commanding, made even the pigeons stir. "Inspector," he said evenly, "I thought you might require assistance." The town grows restless. Lane's eyes flared. "You!" He pointed down at Pomfret with sudden fury. "Tell them what you did. Tell them you buried an empty coffin." Pomfret regarded him without change of expression. "I buried what was given me. The rest was none of my concern." "Liar!" Lane spat. "You helped her. You took her word, closed the box, and let the town believe. Without you, she could never have drawn the money." Purbright's gaze moved from the gallery to the undertaker. "Mr. Pomfret, I must ask plainly. Did you ever see Mallow's body?" Pomfret's pause was measured, as if considering the dignity of truth. "No, Inspector. I relied on the widow's identification of clothing and belongings. The coffin was sealed." A hush followed his admission. Even Love's breath seemed to catch. Lane laughed, harsh and triumphant. "There, you see? I was never there. The coffin was a fraud, the burial a sham, and now I return to claim my place." But Purbright's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. "Yes, Mr. Lane, you claim. Loudly, repeatedly. Yet claims are not proof. In fact, your eagerness damns you. If you were truly Mallow, you would not need to shout. It is precisely the impostor who insists most strongly on identity." Lena's voice cut across them, trembling but sharp. "Then who is he, Inspector? If not my husband, who is this man tormenting me?" Purbright's gaze rested on Lane, weighing him like a specimen. Someone who knew Mallow well enough to mimic his limp, to rehearse his habits, to borrow fragments of memory. But he erred in details. And more importantly, he revealed knowledge of the insurance. Knowledge he could not possess unless he had seen the widow's papers. His eyes flicked briefly toward Francis's absence, then back. "I suspect he found those papers not in his own home, but in another's, perhaps through a boy too easily persuaded. Which means he is no ghost, but a man from the edges of the family. A cousin, perhaps, or a former associate. One who profits by stirring the dead." Lane's face drained of color. For the first time, the confident mask slipped. "You cannot prove that," he whispered. "On the contrary," Purbright said softly, "I already can. When you signed the purchase book at the amenities stall, you wrote Edward Lane. Your hand is firm, deliberate. Yet the real Mallow, by all accounts, had a tremor, the consequence of too many evenings with brandy. Your hand betrayed you more than your tongue." The hall was utterly silent. Even Pomfret, who seldom betrayed interest, tilted his head slightly. Lane staggered back, lantern wavering. "So you mean to destroy me with a flourish of ink?" "No," Purbright said gently. "You destroyed yourself. All I did was watch." In sudden desperation, Lane hurled the lantern again, sparks showering across the gallery. This time, however, Purbright was ready. Love rushed forward, seizing the man's arm as he tried to flee. The struggle was brief. Lane's limp, whether real or affected, slowed him too much. In moments, he was pinned, breathless, glaring down at Purbright with wild eyes. "You'll never prove who I am," he hissed. "The town will believe what it wishes." "Perhaps," Purbright allowed, "but the law requires more than belief, and you have given me that." Later, back at the station, the impostor sat in the cell, silent now, his earlier bravado drained. Mrs. Mallow had been escorted home, shaken but composed. Pomfret had returned to his duties, expression unreadable. Love slumped in a chair, exhausted. "Do you think she knew all along, sir, that he wasn't her husband?" Purbright considered. "I think she knew enough to doubt, and doubt, when prolonged, can torment as cruelly as certainty. But now, at least, she is free of the ghost that would not rest." "And the lad, Francis?" Purbright's gaze softened. "He will recover. Children forget quicker than adults, though sometimes they remember more deeply. Best we give him time." He rose, stretched, and reached for the walking stick once more, its silver band gleaming faintly in the lamplight. "We have not yet heard the last of this business, Love. There remain questions. Who precisely this man is, who encouraged him, and whether the widow herself bears some share of guilt. But the dead man's return, at least, has been shown for what it was. A play, staged in the ruins of a foundry, for an audience too eager to believe." Love yawned, rubbing his eyes. "And what now, sir?" Purbright replaced the stick in the cabinet. "Now? We return to paperwork. It is less dramatic, but infinitely more reliable than the dead." Outside, the bells of St. Michael's struck the hour, thin but insistent. And though the town would gossip for weeks about the ghost of Percival Mallow, Inspector Purbright knew that the true haunting was not of graves or foundries, but of greed, deception, and the stubborn hunger of the living for stories too strange to resist. The morning after the arrest, Flaxborough woke as though nothing had happened. Curtains were drawn back, shop blinds rolled up, milk bottles clinked against step bricks. Yet beneath the ordinariness, the air seemed charged with unspent thunder. People could not decide whether to treat the matter of Percival Mallow's return as scandal, miracle, or comedy. At the post office, clerks repeated fragments of overheard gossip until even they were unsure what version they had begun with. At the grocer's, customers examined one another's faces more carefully than the produce, as though anyone might be the next resurrection. Inspector Purbright, however, preferred order to marvels. He spent the morning at his desk, combing patiently through reports. The impostor had given his name as Edward Lane, but refused further detail. Fingerprints revealed nothing in local records. His manner veered between arrogance and fatigue, as though he had worn his borrowed identity too long, and it had grown heavy. Sergeant Love entered with tea, looking more harassed than refreshed. "Sir, if I may say so, the town's in uproar. Some are convinced he's Mallow, others swear he's an actor hired to swindle the insurance. And Miss Teesdale," he sighed. "Miss Teesdale says she'll write a pamphlet on it all, for posterity." Purbright accepted the tea. "Posterity will be flattered. Meanwhile, we must decide whether to charge him as Mallow alive or as Lane the impostor. Each path leads to different inconveniences." Love frowned. "But if he's really Mallow, then his wife's been paid insurance on a living man, and that's fraud. If he's not Mallow, then he's been blackmailing her with threats about Skegness, and that's fraud too. Either way, it smells." "Fraud," Purbright said mildly, "is one of those perfumes that clings to everyone in the room. The difficulty lies in identifying the bottle." By mid-afternoon, Mrs. Mallow herself came to the station. She entered the inspector's office with the brisk composure of someone determined not to be pitied. Her black coat was buttoned high, her gloves immaculate, but her eyes betrayed a sleepless night. "Inspector," she said without preamble, "I want this matter ended. That man is not my husband. He is an impostor, a tormentor, and I will not have him spoken of in the same breath as Percival Mallow. Charge him or release him, but do not leave me in limbo." Purbright regarded her steadily. "Limbo, Mrs. Mallow, is precisely where your husband's identity now rests. Until we determine who this man is, your own position remains uncertain. If he is Mallow, then your claim to insurance was premature. If he is not, then someone has been feeding him private knowledge. Knowledge that might have come only from within your household." Her lips pressed tightly. "You imply, my nephew." "I imply nothing," Purbright said gently. "But Francis has been seen in his company, and the boy is impressionable." "He is also innocent," she said firmly. "If anyone has misled him, it is that man. And if the law cannot protect us, Inspector, then perhaps we must protect ourselves." Purbright's brows rose slightly. "A dangerous sentiment, madam. The law grows jealous when others attempt to replace it." She stared at him a moment longer, then turned on her heel and left without another word. That evening, Purbright returned to the foundry alone. He walked slowly through the yard, pausing at the gallery where the impostor had staged his appearances. The lantern's scorch still marked the floorboards, a charred reminder of performance and panic. Why here? Why always the bells? He studied the pits in the floor where molten bronze had once cooled into bell shapes. Empty hollows now, but still echoing faintly if one stamped upon the ground. He crouched, touched the damp earth, and caught the faint scent of oil. Recent, not industrial. Someone had been using the place for more than theatrics. When he returned to the station, he requested a check on recent visitors to Flaxborough lodging houses. Within an hour, a constable produced a list. Among the names was one that made Purbright pause. Harold Craven, a commercial traveller once associated with Mallow in dubious investments. Craven had taken a room 3 days before Lane's first appearance. He had since vanished. "Love," Purbright said, summoning the sergeant, "we may have discovered our playwright." Lane is merely the actor. Craven provided the script, details of Mallow's life, mannerisms, debts, perhaps even the scar. In return, Lane would demand money, unsettle the widow, and split the profits. Love's eyes widened. And the foundry. Craven's chosen stage. Empty, out of the way, resonant with symbolism. Bells that never ring again. A fitting theatre for a ghost. But where's Craven now? "Gone," Purbright said quietly. "Which means he took what he wanted. Perhaps Francis too knows more than he realizes. We must be careful with the boy." The following morning brought fresh shock. A fisherman discovered a body by the canal lock. Harold Craven, face bruised, pockets emptied. His death was officially attributed to an accident, but Purbright knew better. Too convenient, too swift. Someone had silenced the man who held the script. Lane, confronted with the news, displayed no grief. He merely shrugged. The world is full of unfortunate drownings. Purbright studied him. Indeed, though some seem more rehearsed than others. That afternoon, Purbright visited Francis at Harcourt Terrace. The boy sat by the window, pale and anxious, fiddling with a pack of cards. "Francis," Purbright said gently, "you have been brave already, but there is one more truth you must tell. Did Mr. Lane ever mention a man named Craven?" Francis hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. He said Craven was helping him. He said Craven knew how to make things right again. But then he laughed and said Craven always took more than his share." Purbright's eyes softened. "Thank you, Francis. That was important." When he left the house, Lena Mallow stopped him at the door. "Inspector," she said in a low voice, "if what you suspect is true, then I am as much a victim as anyone. Do not forget that." "I forget nothing," Purbright said gently. "But truth has an unfortunate habit of staining those who touch it, even unwillingly." That evening, Purbright called Love into his office. "It is time we set our own stage. Lane believes himself clever. He thrives on performance. We shall give him one more." Love looked doubtful. "You mean, let him think he's convinced us?" "Precisely. We shall let him believe the town is ready to welcome its dead man. He will overplay his role and, in doing so, reveal the truth." And so, the next night, word quietly spread that the police would permit Lane to address the town in the hall of the Mechanics' Institute. People gathered in murmuring knots, faces alight with curiosity and mischief. Some carried lanterns, others notebooks. Miss Teesdale sat primly in the front row, prepared to record history. Lane was brought in, his limp exaggerated, his head held high. He looked around the hall with triumphant satisfaction. "Good people of Flaxborough," he began, his voice sonorous. "You buried me too soon, but I have returned, and I claim my place." The audience gasped, then tittered. The mayor coughed awkwardly. Miss Teesdale scribbled furiously. Purbright stood at the side, arms folded, watching. Lane raised his hands dramatically. "My wife profited by my death. The undertaker conspired. And the town—" He leaned forward. "The town owes me restitution." At that precise moment, Purbright stepped forward, his voice calm but cutting. "Thank you, Mr. Lane. That will do. For you have just condemned yourself. You speak of conspiracies you could not know unless you had spoken with Craven, and Craven, as we now know, lies drowned in the canal." A stir ran through the hall. Lane's face blanched. Purbright continued, his tone even. "You are no ghost, no Mallow returned, but an impostor coached by a man now dead. Your hand betrayed you, your tongue betrayed you, and now your ambition has betrayed you. The performance is over." Love stepped forward, hand on Lane's shoulder. The man sagged, his defiance leaking away. "You'll never prove it," he muttered. "We already have," Purbright said softly. The crowd dispersed, murmuring, half disappointed that the ghost had been reduced to flesh and fraud. Miss Teesdale declared she would still write her pamphlet, though she might allow herself a little irony. Back in his office, Purbright closed his ledger with finality. "The dead man has returned only as far as the station cells. Tomorrow he will go further still, to trial. After that, Flaxborough will resume its routines, as it always does." Love looked relieved. "So that's it, then? The end?" "Not quite," Purbright murmured. "There remains the matter of Mrs. Mallow, whether she suspected more than she admitted, whether she was glad secretly of the impostor's torments. But those are questions for her conscience, not for the court." He extinguished the lamp, leaving the office in shadow. And in the quiet that followed, the bells of St. Michael's rang faintly across the town. Their cracked notes lingered in the air like echoes of a play concluded. A reminder that in Flaxborough, even the dead could return, if only long enough to be useful to the living. Snow fell that night in light, uncertain flakes, dusting the tiled roofs and whitening the cobbles as though the town had been pressed between pages of a storybook. Flaxborough looked almost innocent beneath the frost, but Inspector Purbright knew innocence here was as rare as silence in the library when Miss Teesdale was present. By morning, gossip had thickened like the snow. The Mechanics' Institute meeting, where the impostor had been publicly unmasked, had left the town both satisfied and disappointed. They were relieved to know they were not haunted, but disheartened to discover they had been deprived of a good ghost. Nothing so vulgar as fraud could compete with the thrill of resurrection. Purbright entered the station to find Sergeant Love hunched over a pile of statements. "Sir," Love said wearily, "half the town claims they saw him first, and the other half swears they always knew he wasn't Mallow. If we took them all at their word, Flaxborough would have had more detectives than citizens. An enviable state, Purbright remarked, removing his coat, though perhaps not efficient. Love sighed. What happens now? Trial? In due course, Purbright replied. He sat down, steepling his fingers. But before then, we must clear the fog around the coffin. A man cannot impersonate a ghost unless the grave itself conspires. The matter of the coffin returned like a persistent cough. Pomfret, the undertaker, when questioned again, remained as composed as a pew at evensong. Inspector, I did not see the body. I saw clothing. I heard assurances. I sealed a box. I cannot conjure more. Purbright studied him. But you must have noticed weight. A coffin carries differently when full. Pomfret's eyes did not blink. I carry all with equal dignity, and dignity does not measure in pounds. It was, Purbright reflected, both an answer and an evasion. That afternoon, Mrs. Mallow called again at the station. She entered briskly, her face pale but her back unyielding. "Inspector," she said, "I will not endure further whispers. You have your impostor. You have exposed his tricks, but the town still looks at me as though I invited him back. I insist you tell them plainly I am innocent." Purbright regarded her gently. "Innocence, Mrs. Mallow, is not always a matter of fact, but of perception, and perception is rarely persuaded by police statements." Her gloved hands clenched. "Then you leave me to their malice." "Not so. I leave you to their forgetfulness, which in Flaxborough is fortunately rapid. Already tomorrow's scandal prepares itself." Her lips pressed thinly. "That is no comfort." "Comfort," Purbright said mildly, "is seldom in my job description." That evening a fresh development intruded. Francis, the boy, failed to return from school. His absence was first noticed by Mrs. Glossop's niece, who had been instructed to walk with him. By dusk, neighbors were whispering, and by dark, Mrs. Mallow herself came in distress to the station. Purbright rose at once. "Love, alert the constables. Search the canal banks and the foundry." Mrs. Mallow, near tears, clutched his arm. "He would not run away. He is timid, easily frightened. Someone has taken him." Purbright's expression, though calm, hardened. "Then we must consider who. Our impostor is locked in the cell unless he has mastered spiritual travel. But his accomplice, Mr. Craven, lies drowned, or so it seems. Yet fraud seldom works alone." The search stretched into the night. Lanterns bobbed along the towpaths, voices called into the mist. At last, near the churchyard, a constable found footprints leading to the rear gate. Small feet hurried alongside heavier prints. A scarf belonging to Francis lay snagged on the iron railings. Love brought it back, face grim. "Someone lured him here, sir, away from the main road. Could be he was promised answers." Purbright nodded slowly. "The boy is the thread. Whoever wove this masquerade relied on him to carry messages, to pass slips of paper. Now they fear he may unravel their work." At dawn, a letter arrived at the station, slipped under the door. Its handwriting was jagged, hurried. "If you want the boy, bring no police." Midnight. The foundry. Alone. Love swore softly. "They mean to trade." Purbright read the letter twice, then folded it neatly. "Yes, they mean to stage one final act, and we must decide whether to let them perform." By evening, the plan was set. Purbright would attend, but not alone. Love and 2 constables would conceal themselves outside the foundry, ready to intervene. The snow had thickened, deadening sound, making every step treacherously loud. At midnight, Purbright entered the foundry. His lantern cut a narrow cone of light through the darkness. The pits gaped like open mouths, the rafters hung with restless pigeons. A voice came from the gallery. "Inspector, punctual as ever." Lane stood there, though he should have been in the cell, His limp was pronounced, his face pale. Beside him, held by the arm, was Francis, pale, frightened, but unharmed. "Remarkable," Purbright said calmly. "You appear to have escaped mortality twice, over the grave and our custody." Lane's eyes glittered. "You should know by now, Inspector, that coffins and cells are but temporary inconveniences. Release me, and the boy lives. Refuse and—" He pressed a knife lightly against Francis's sleeve. Purbright's voice remained mild. "And the town will believe in ghosts all over again. But what would that profit you now? Your accomplice is dead, your performance exposed. What remains but farce?" Lane's jaw tightened. "I still have one secret left. The boy knows it. That is why I keep him." Purbright tilted his head. "Then perhaps you would tell me, so I may applaud before the curtain falls." Lane hesitated, then said with sudden ferocity, "The body in the coffin was not Mallow. It was Craven's doing. A vagrant dressed in Mallow's clothes passed off as drowned. Lena agreed. She wanted the money. I was promised a share, but she betrayed me. Now I take what is mine, or I expose her." The confession rang through the hall. At that moment, Love and the constables surged in from the shadows, lanterns blazing. Lane wheeled, startled. Francis slipped from his grasp and stumbled into Purbright's arms. The struggle was brief. Lane, weakened by fear and exhaustion, was overpowered, the knife clattering to the floor. He was dragged away, cursing that the truth would damn them all. Back at the station, Francis was comforted and sent home under guard. Lane, once secured again, sat silent in his cell, all bravado drained. Love, shaken, said, "So it was all a sham. The coffin, the body, the ghost, all arranged, and the widow knew." Purbright's eyes were grave. "So he claims. But men in desperation embroider their guilt with the threads of others. Whether she consented or merely suspected remains uncertain. Yet she cannot escape that her silence gave the lie breath." The next morning, Purbright called upon Mrs. Mallow. She received him stiffly, her face pale but defiant. "Inspector," she said, "I hear you rescued Francis. For that I thank you, but I will not listen to more accusations. My husband is dead. Whatever impostors or accomplices claim, I will not be made their victim again." Purbright studied her. "The truth, Mrs. Mallow, has many guises. Sometimes it is the one we choose, sometimes the one thrust upon us. But remember this, silence is a choice also, and often the loudest." Her gaze did not waver, though her hands trembled. "Then let silence be my answer." When he returned to the station, Love asked, "What do we do with her, sir?" Purbright settled behind his desk, expression unreadable. "We do what the law allows. We charge the impostor with fraud, with abduction, with conspiracy. As for the widow, unless proof binds her, we leave her to her conscience. That is a court sterner than any assizes." He picked up the walking stick once more, its silver band gleaming faintly. For a moment, he regarded the initials. PM. Then he placed it carefully back into the cabinet. "The dead," he said softly, "should remain where they are put. When they do not, it is always the living who suffer." Love nodded, weary but relieved. "And what of Francis?" Purbright allowed the faintest smile. "The boy will heal. Childhood is merciful that way, but he will never look at the canal without remembering. Perhaps that is lesson enough." As dusk fell, the bells of St. Michael's tolled once more, cracked and hesitant, but steady. Flaxborough's streets filled with ordinary life again. Gossip shifting to sales at the draper's. Complaints about the weather. The scandal of the dead man's return began its slow descent into anecdote, then into legend, where it would lie beside countless other tales of the town's peculiarities. Inspector Purbright, at his desk, resumed his paperwork with the quiet satisfaction of a man who understood that in Flaxborough The line between the living and the dead was not nearly so firm as Stone suggested, but that the law, at least, still preferred its coffins shut. Morning sunlight crept over Flaxborough with the pallid caution of a guest unsure whether it was welcome. Snow still clung to gutters and chimneys, but the sky was clear, promising a day when ordinary life might resume. The greengrocer arranged his cabbages with unusual precision. The postmistress insisted twice as loudly that her scales were accurate. The mayor rehearsed a speech for the Rotary dinner as though nothing at all had happened. Yet in every whispered exchange, from the cobbler's bench to the pew polishers at St. Michael's, the name of Percival Mallow drifted like smoke. Some still insisted he had risen from the grave, others that he had been replaced by a cousin or an actor, and more than a few preferred to believe that Inspector Purbright had invented the whole business to keep the town entertained through a dreary winter. At the police station, Purbright sat in his office, spectacles low on his nose, working through a stack of reports with his familiar serenity. Sergeant Love entered, carrying a tray of tea and two anxious expressions, one belonging to himself, the other borrowed from the townsfolk. "Sir," he began, setting down the tray, "they're not letting it rest. The high street's thick with talk. Some reckon Mrs. Mallow's part of it all. Others want to know if we've truly caught the right man. And Miss Teesdale says she's organizing a lecture entitled Flaxborough's Phantom, Fact or Folly. There'll be slides, apparently." Purbright sipped his tea. "Then the town's appetite for the uncanny remains hearty. But gossip, love, is like porridge, filling at the time, but seldom remembered by luncheon. It will pass." Love shifted uncomfortably. "And Mrs. Mallow, sir, is she off the hook?" "Hooks," Purbright murmured, "have many barbs. Legally, we can prove little beyond silence. Morally, that is another court entirely." Later that morning, Mrs. Mallow herself arrived at the station. She carried herself with the composure of someone accustomed to disapproval, though the stiffness in her shoulders betrayed the strain. "Inspector," she said crisply, "I'm here for one reason. My nephew. Francis has been through an ordeal no child should endure. I insist that you assure me, and him, that no more of this will intrude upon his life. If that man remains in your cells, keep him there. If he goes to trial, let it be swift. But Francis must be left in peace." Purbright inclined his head. "The boy will be protected, Mrs. Mallow. He has been more truthful than many adults in this matter, though he did not realize it. But peace is seldom given. It must be chosen. I hope you may help him choose it." She looked at him sharply, as if to read an accusation between his words, but Purbright's gaze remained mild, and after a moment she lowered her eyes. "Then that is all I ask. Good day, Inspector." By afternoon, the impostor, still answering only to Lane, was moved under guard to the county jail. As he was escorted through the yard, townsfolk gathered discreetly at corners, pretending to examine lamp-posts or window displays while peering at him with mingled fascination and relief. He walked with his usual exaggerated limp, head high, as though proud of having unsettled so many. Miss Teesdale, notebook clutched firmly, whispered to her neighbor, "Observe the theatrical gait. No genuine invalid would consent to limp so rhythmically. I shall make a point of it in my pamphlet." The mayor, when later asked, insisted he had always known the man was a fraud. No true Flaxborough man would neglect to pay his subscription to the Civic Amenities Committee. Thus the impostor departed, leaving the town to digest its excitement in the only way it knew, by retelling it with ever-fresh embellishments. That evening, Purbright walked alone to the churchyard. Snow lay unevenly on the stones, muffling his tread. He paused by Mallow's headstone, the inscription sharp against the frost. "Beloved husband, faithful friend." The grave beneath was empty, of course, or at least uncertain. But the stone remained, stubborn as reputation. Purbright stood a while, reflecting on the peculiar human tendency to accept what was written in stone even when the soil beneath said otherwise. Behind him, the familiar soft voice of Mr. Pomfret interrupted. "Inspector, I see you also prefer to walk among those who no longer answer back." Purbright turned, unsurprised to find the undertaker materializing like punctuation. "Good evening, Mr. Pomfret. I was considering how the dead prove easier companions than the living." Pomfret inclined his head. "They seldom contradict, though they may be misquoted." He glanced at the stone. "Will you order it removed?" "No," Purbright said softly. "Let it stand. The town prefers certainty, even if mistaken. Removing it would only feed new legends." Pomfret considered this, then gave his faint, professional smile. "Quite so. The living need their symbols. The dead, after all, are indifferent." The following day, Francis was returned to school. The boy walked quietly between classmates who regarded him with awe, as though he had briefly entered a world adults spoke of only in hushed tones. Purbright, watching discreetly from the street corner, saw the lad's shoulders lift a little under their gaze. Not pride, exactly, but the fragile awareness of survival. Love, standing beside him, said, "He'll be all right, sir." Children forget. "Not forget," Purbright corrected gently. "They absorb, which is worse or better, depending on what they've absorbed." By the week's end, Flaxborough had resumed its habitual balance of gossip and routine. The bakery debated the sugar rationing of 1947 as though it had happened yesterday. The council prepared to argue over lamp posts. Miss Teesdale's pamphlet was already in draft, promising to sell briskly at the library counter. For Purbright, there remained paperwork, reports to complete, statements to collate, and the quiet satisfaction of returning to crimes less flamboyant than resurrection. Love, bringing in another stack of files, sighed. "Feels almost dull now, sir." "Dull," Purbright said, adjusting his spectacles, "is the inspector's best friend. The living are troublesome enough without their ghosts." On Friday evening, Purbright locked the last of the files, extinguished the lamp, and left the station. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and as he walked past St. Michael's, the cracked bells struck the hour. Their tone was uncertain but steady, echoing over rooftops dusted with snow. He paused, listening. The bells had tolled through the entire affair, sometimes ominous, sometimes absurd, yet always there, as reminders that time moved forward, indifferent to impostors and scandals. Purbright resumed his walk with the calm of a man who understood his town, its hunger for spectacle, its quick suspicion, its quicker forgetfulness. The dead man who had returned was already receding into legend, and by spring he would be no more than a tale told across teacups. And so Flaxborough, with its gossip and its dignity, its secrets and its silences, settled once more into itself. Purbright returned to his home, set aside his hat, and reached for a plain folder of unfinished reports. Tomorrow would bring more small crimes, more whispered scandals, more polite evasions. The routine of Flaxborough, which to outsiders seemed sleepy, but to Inspector Purbright was endlessly eloquent. He dipped his pen, made a neat note in the margin, and allowed himself the faintest of smiles. The end.